I'm Jez, and I want to talk about why Agile causes arguments. And I'm kind of taking a risk with this one because I don't know if your experience of Agile will have been the same as mine. Kind of hoping it will, but let's find out. So I started about 10 years ago, and I've kind of been in some really quite heavy, big arguments about Agile, about doing Scrum wrong, about doing Agile wrong. Really kind of red-faced, shouty, passive-aggressive, all sorts of stuff like that. And I was doing a talk end of last year, and someone came up to me and said, I'm so glad you talked about Agile in a kind of really friendly way, because when I tried to get involved in it, I just had this group of people kind of snarling at me and saying, you don't get it, you're not part of this world, and kind of pushing me away. And I'm lucky enough to have spent the last 2 years kind of studying Agile from an academic point of view. And I came across a paper, which is what this talk is about, by a guy called Philippe Cruchton. And I loved it because I read this quote and just kind of went, yes, you're talking about what I'm talking about. I've been distraught at the level of dogmatism, bigotry, contempt, or just plain ignorance that I witness in the Agile world, present company accepted. But it was really interesting because he's like, well, there's someone else noticing kind of what I'm noticing. And then he kind of goes through and explains why he thinks this is happening. And I think first of all, to get this, we have to kind of understand what Agile is. Can we get to a definition of Agile? And I'm not particularly sure we can. You could look at it from a process point of view and say Agile is Scrum, Agile is XP, Agile is Kanban, and it isn't. It's more than that. It's intuitively kind of more than that. You could say Agile is what people think it is. Is it what Mike Cohn says it is? Is it what Jim Highsmith says it is? And again, it's not, because they kind of disagree with each other. There's no common definition between them. Or you could say Agile is about the environment. Agile works really well in complex, fast-paced, uncertain environments. Wouldn't work so well for, say, civil engineering or building a bridge. But again, Agile is more than just that. Or you could say Agile is the manifesto. It's a great document, I love it, but at the same time, it's not really black and white. It's individuals and interactions over processes and tools. It doesn't say how much. There's no kind of, I'm right and you're wrong in this. It's all kind of shades of grey. Brilliant. Or you could define Agile by saying what it isn't. You could say Agile isn't waterfall. But at the same time, Agile isn't a method for making pork pies in the northeast of England. Saying what it isn't really a coherent way of defining something. It's just saying what it isn't, not what it is. And I really like Cruchton's article because he says basically Agile is a culture. He says, my first claim is that agility is not a technology, science or product, but a culture. I realise that this presents an even more difficult task, defining culture. And he goes on to quote someone called Helen Spencer Oaty, who says, culture is a fuzzy set of attitudes, beliefs, behavioural norms and basic assumptions and values that are shared by a group of people and that influence each member's behaviour and his/her interpretation of the meaning of other people's behaviour. And I think the two really interesting bits in that are that it's a fuzzy set of attitudes, it's not coherent, it's not black and white, it's kind of amorphous around the edges. And also it affects your interpretation of other people's behaviour. A culture isn't just about how you behave, it's about how you perceive the behaviour of other people. And I think this kind of explains the thing you get where if you say waterfall to a non-Agile person, they might think of a beautiful, lovely waterfall like that. And occasionally if you say waterfall to an Agile person, you think of a horrible lava thing right in the depths of hell. It's awful, it's them, it's that culture over there. We're Agile, we're not waterfall. And you get this really interesting sort of cultural difference between the two. And Cruchton talks about Richard Dawkins and his idea of the selfish gene, and the idea that he comes up with from that one is the idea of a meme. A meme is, in this sense, a chunk of culture, a self-replicating chunk of culture, a thing that you can transmit from mind to mind and kind of spreads almost like a virus, really. And the thing with memes is that they don't spread because they're good, because they're right, because they're successful, because they're important. They spread kind of because they're memorable and they're easy to spread. So just because something is spreading, just because ideas are spreading, doesn't mean they're right, just means they're good at spreading. And he also talks about the idea of a memeplex, which is a whole collection of memes together. So Scrum, for example, is a memeplex. Say you had a daily stand-up, that's one meme. You had a retrospective, that's another meme. Put them all together, you get this kind of collective memeplex kind of thing. But at the same time, memeplexes create cultures. When you've got a whole bunch of different things, different ways of ruling how people are interacting with each other, you start creating a culture around that. And memes and memeplexes also developing cultures. They come from somewhere. And I think we often lose sight of that too, the context that these things originally happened in. So if you look at things like big upfront design, we say no big upfront design, but kind of why not in our context? That will have come up with at some point in some context, I don't know where, someone came up with that, and it was probably brilliant in that particular context. It might be brilliant in your context too, but you don't know it's great in your context unless you actually take a moment to consider it. If you just get dogmatic about it and say, right, no big upfront design, that's that, and you're kind of forgetting that things should change as they move through contexts. The one I really hate as well is Acne, you ain't going to need it. That really bugs me because it kind of just becomes shorthand for I can't be bothered, I don't really want to do that, I don't really know how to do that, but I don't want to admit I don't know how to do that. And to me it's kind of arrogance to say, well, how do you know I'm not going to need it? Sure, in your last place when someone discussed this particular thing, on your last software build when someone discussed this, you didn't need that thing. But how do we know we don't need it in this context? Can we at least have that conversation rather than just being a bit aggressive and being like, you ain't going to need it, shut down the conversation, that's that. You're kind of forgetting the context with that sort of stuff. And basically, Crutchton's point is that Agile is actually a faith. Agile is kind of akin to religion in your mind. There's no empirical sort of black or white around it. There's no sort of I'm right and you're wrong. There's no way of proving that. So, and it can obviously be different in different contexts. So actually, it's just a faith you hold on to. He says here, Agilistas often lose track that our topic is not natural science, that they're not getting closer to the knowledge of the one true way of developing software, and that all of this is just collections of opinions with varying degrees of consensuality. There isn't a black or white on this one. We all kind of believe different things. We inevitably believe different things because we've all got different personal biases and so forth. And for me, that's why you get arguments. If you start thinking of Agile as a faith, you think of how faith behaves in other contexts, like in religion, for example. You get wars of religion. You get people shooting each other over really small points of detail because you kind of internally know that you're not certainly right. You think you're right, you believe you're right, but you can't know that you are. And then when someone turns up and challenges that, you feel kind of threatened. You go, well, this is my faith, this is my culture, this is the thing I'm hanging on to. And someone else is questioning that. You're questioning a really deep-seated thing you're believing. And you get aggressive about it. You can kind of shut down the debate and say, no, this is my faith, this is what's true. So that's kind of my take on Crutchton's article. I really like it. You can find it online, and there's a reference to it at the start as well. But I didn't want to leave it without saying what are kind of 4 solutions to this. How can you fix it? And obviously, having said there's no black or white, I can't just give you a checklist of stuff to do. But there's kind of 4 points that I think would be kind of useful. First of all, don't argue. It sounds really obvious, but once you start thinking in this way, especially once I'd read his article and really absorbed it, it's kind of funny when you see people arguing now. It's kind of like, this is so absurd. Why are we even arguing? That's ridiculous. Like, you don't get Agile, do you, if you're kind of really, really vehemently arguing about this? Lose the idea that there's one true way. There kind of isn't. You know, your context matters, your personal biases matter, the biases of other people matter. So many different variables going on that will shape your particular interpretation, your particular implementation, your particular best way of doing things at that time. Be open. There's a really interesting point he makes about being open about who you are, who your biases are, what informs your opinions, rather than just saying, I think this and that's that. Say why you think that. Be open about who you are. I wanted to say at the start of this quite deliberately that I've just spent 2 years academically studying this, because that's very different from spending 2 years kind of doing this in a real life context. You know, I am now slightly academic. That is a bias I have. People who don't do academia but do very much more practical stuff might be vehemently disagreeing with me, but that's probably a personal bias thing rather than one being right or one being wrong. And as well as being open about who you are and your own personal biases and so forth, be curious about other people. If someone challenges something you're thinking, find out why. Kind of approach them with a level of trust that you should have in an Agile environment and say, right, well, why are we thinking differently? How can we talk this through? How can we work this out? And be kind of really interested in it. Be excited that someone is challenging your views. Don't see it as dogma. Don't see it as faith. Actually be open to all that stuff. And I'm in within time as well. Thank you. Cool.